Welcome to COM 4740 Intercultural Communication. This is the lecture on Chapter 4, where we continue our look at the history of intercultural communication. Again, as we talk about history, keep the idea of standpoint in mind, and that histories are told through the frames or lenses of the teller. So they're told from the point of view of the teller. And as we go back in time, this history teller or writer was often the victorious one in the situation, often a white male who was the literate person of the age. So keep in mind that a lot of the histories that we know were told through that viewpoint. As you work through Chapter 4, you're going to find descriptions of a wide variety of kinds of histories, especially different kinds of ways of looking at culture. And these are quite fascinating. You could look at a culture's political history, the history of leadership in that group and the ideologies. You could look at their intellectual history or the history of ideas. You could look at the social history of the culture, the family history, the history of the family in that particular setting. You can look at a national history or the history of a cultural group within that nation. These are but a few of the different kinds of histories that we can examine when we're studying intercultural communication. Our authors do a great job of expanding on all of these and giving some great examples, so I encourage you to read that part carefully. What we know about history is from reading people's accounts of what happened, but history isn't always reported. There are gaps in our historical knowledge, and there are two kinds of gaps we might encounter. One is called absent history. Absent history is history that was never recorded. So this might be history from pre-literate times. It might be things that were not written down just because they weren't considered important. I can give you an example. You've probably heard of Henry VIII of England and his 6 wives. I've always been fascinated with the Tudors, and one of the things we don't know for sure is Anne Boleyn's birth date. Some people believe she was born in 1501, some people believe she was born in 1507. We don't know for sure, and the reason we don't know is that in those days people didn't have birth certificates, and if someone's date of birth was recorded, it was written in the family Bible. And oftentimes only the birth dates of boys were recorded because girls weren't considered as important in those times. So Anne Boleyn's birth date was never recorded, so we don't know when she was born. So that's an absent history. Hidden history is a different story. Hidden history exists but is suppressed. In other words, this is history that we would have access to if someone wasn't hiding it from us, if they weren't suppressing the story. And people in positions of power might withhold information from others in order to keep them from knowing that history. And the book I have shown here, Kalamazoo Gals, A Story of Extraordinary Women and Gibson's Banner Guitars of World War II. This is a fascinating history that was hidden until very recently. And I really encourage you to go out on the internet and read up on this. But the gist of it is that during World War II, when all the men went off to war, the Kalamazoo Gibson guitar factory was supposed to be closed down or devoted to only wartime uses, and it wasn't. They kept on making guitars, and since all the men were off at war, the factory was staffed by women. So during World War II, women were making Gibson Banner guitars in Kalamazoo at this factory. And guitar collectors really value the guitars of that particular era because they are made a little differently and they're considered to be very well made with a great deal of attention to detail, which is interesting to think about because they were made by women. But would the purchasers of those guitars want a guitar that they knew was made by women at that time? And would people have disapproved of these girls making guitars rather than wartime supplies during that time? So the story of the Kalamazoo Gals has been kind of a hidden history until recently when this gentleman wrote this book about them and did some research about them. So that history was suppressed for any number of reasons. Maybe the Gibson Company not wanting to have any legal or financial or reputational trouble, not wanting those guitars not to sell, a variety of monetary motivations probably, but it's interesting to think about. So when there's something we don't know, we can try to find out if it's absent history or hidden history. For example, were there female physicians in the 1400s in Spain? Well, there aren't any recordings of there being female physicians, but that doesn't mean there weren't any. It's absent history. We don't know enough to conclude that there weren't any. It was never recorded. But hidden history is history that comes to light that was deliberately suppressed for the reasons of the person who suppressed it. So as critical scholars, we need to ask, is history always reported correctly? Is it always reported factually and faithfully to the events that happened? Well, a critical scholar knows that these stories are always told through the point of view of the teller, and perhaps some of the traditional understandings we have or the traditional stories we've heard have more to them than what we know. And here's a great example of that. In history class, we learned that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and the slaves were freed. And so we get this mental image of Lincoln signed a paper and instantly the slaves were freed. Well, that's not exactly the way it happened. And this painting called The Hour of Emancipation is inaccurate. The painting shows slaves waiting for the stroke of midnight when they'll be free. And that's anachronistic. It didn't happen that way. The slaves did not know in advance about the Emancipation Proclamation, and many of them didn't even know afterwards because they weren't informed that they had been freed. Also, the proclamation itself stated that Lincoln would order the emancipation of all slaves in any state of the Confederacy that did not return to Union control by January 1st, 1863. So the Emancipation Proclamation was really an ultimatum given to the Confederate states that they had better rejoin the Union or their slaves would be freed in the future. So some of that might differ from what you learned in school or had been taught about this particular historical event. And that brings us to Juneteenth. Now, we were talking about how President Lincoln gave the Confederate States an ultimatum that they had to rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, or the slaves would be freed. As we all know from our history classes, the Confederacy did not rejoin the Union. The slaves were declared freed, and so we imagine in our minds that they all just left the plantations and left their bondage and went on to better lives. But think of the position of the slave owner. How are the slaves going to find out they're free unless you tell them? And you have a vested interest in not letting them know. So, it wasn't until June 19th, 1865 that slaves in Texas learned that they were free, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, because Union soldiers arrived in Texas spreading the news. So this is a great example of information power. Think about how those in power had control over information, who received that information, and when that information was disseminated. So going back to this idea of who tells the story and who writes the history, who gets to govern how things work. In this case, again, it was white literate males. They wrote letters to one another and read newspapers, and they knew the slaves were free. But those who were not literate and were not part of the power structure had no way of finding out. Take a moment to think about how past history plays a part in intercultural relationships today, how this history gets absorbed into our culture and into our attitudes and behaviors. And while we might not have been directly involved in those events, we might benefit or suffer disadvantages because of events of the past. There is a video in the supplemental videos folder called The Privilege Walk that I would like you to watch. It does a really good job of illustrating different forms of privilege and how privilege might be more than we think it is. So please go take a look at that. Some believe we should make reparations to cultural groups that have been oppressed in the past, and we should apologize and pay money to groups of people who were sidelined or mistreated in our country's history. A couple of examples of this idea. If you look on page 142 of the text, you'll find George W. Bush's letter to the Japanese. This is a letter that the president wrote to Japanese Americans who had been placed in internment camps at the beginning of World War II as a way of apologizing after the fact for that event and paying some money to those people. Another example of reparations that you might sometimes hear about in common modern discussion, it's been discussed on the news from time to time, is whether the United States government should pay reparations to African Americans who were descendants of slaves for the unpaid wages and the other kinds of mistreatments and the personal traumas that their ancestors went through. So if you look in the supplemental videos folder, I've given you a link to a video discussing the idea of the U.S. government paying reparations to African Americans, and it's a clip from The West Wing. So it is fictionalized, but the two men in the discussion do a really good job of outlining both sides of that issue, in my opinion. So it's worth a watch. Please take a look at that and then ponder for yourself, what do these apologies and remedies do? Do they accomplish something? Do they not? Do they help make things fair? Do they at least represent a gesture toward making things fair? Do they serve a purpose in our culture or not? Spend some time pondering that, if you would. What would a critical scholar say about all of this? Well, a critical scholar would start by saying, It's naive to claim that history has no effect on the present. We know that the past actions of people in positions of power in our own culture are still having an effect on the present day. The critical scholar would say that we enjoy privilege or suffer disadvantage because of our history and how we've handled events in the past, and that understanding this history might help us to improve intercultural communication as we acknowledge the effects of the past. So while I can't change what came before, I can be aware of how it is affecting the standpoint and worldview of people who did go through it, or the ways in which it is absorbed and permeated into our society and the ways we interact with each other. I can improve my own awareness of that, if nothing else, and that awareness should help to make me more empathetic and effective in communicating across culture. This chapter introduces the contact hypothesis, which is the idea that you could take people from a variety of cultures and backgrounds and put them all together, and that they will interact with one another and communicate together and gain a greater understanding simply by being put in the same room with one another. Now, as you look at the world around you, you might say, no, that doesn't really work. And you'd be right, it doesn't really work. One example of it not working is the diversity backlash on college campuses. We know that college admissions departments try to create a diverse student body in their admissions, and the idea is we admit these students from all different backgrounds, we put them all in a dorm together, and they're all going to learn wonderful things about difference and about other people. But when we look around us, we know that there's a human tendency to self-segregate and to feel more comfortable with our own kind, however we define that. And so this diversity backlash refers to the fact that the more diverse the student body, the more they tend to self-segregate and not interact across difference. So it kind of backfires, this idea of the contact hypothesis. Now, it can work, and the way to make it work is to facilitate the interaction. So someone in a position of leadership and authority and institutional backing has to facilitate the interactions, bring people together to engage in dialogue, for example. When you do that, it can work, but simply putting people in a space with one another is not going to facilitate interaction. I'd like to introduce you to the idea of diaspora at this point, and it's a word we're going to encounter more during the semester. Diaspora means scattered, so it's a cultural group or group of people who have been scattered. So think of refugees, think of different cultural groups that have been moved around the world or that you would find in different cities of the world. For example, just about every big city in the US has a Chinatown. So that we could define as the diaspora of Chinese living in America. They're scattered, they're outside of their homeland. You might hear of the Jewish diaspora. We know that there are a certain number of Jews living in Israel, but they're also scattered all over the world. So people who are members of a diasporic culture are often living in enclaves or pockets of people in different cities and locations, and they are interacting with the larger culture around them while at the same time trying to maintain the ethnic practices of their own home culture. So the diaspora is another example of how the contact hypothesis doesn't necessarily work. We tend to congregate with those who are like us unless interaction is facilitated by some person in a position of leadership. Think about these questions. Is race a biological reality, or is it a socially created thing? So what is race and who is white? Do you think of race as a skin color, an economic status, a social class, all of the above? In the early 20th century, when a lot of immigrants were coming in through New York, if you look at those records, you'll find that at that time, Jews were not considered white, Italians were not considered white. It doesn't always have to do with the color of skin. It can also be a socioeconomic designation. And who is white enough to be considered white? What does your ancestry have to be considered white and to enjoy the privileges of being white? Ponder that in your own mind and think about what designates one individual as white and not another. Understanding our social history, our cultural history, our national history can help us to examine these questions to make a better future where we're interacting across difference in a more positive way. I know some of these questions are pretty theoretical. Some of them might be things you haven't thought much about, but I invite you to struggle with these ideas as you try to improve your own awareness of difference. And that is chapter 4 of our text on the history of intercultural communication.